Good morning, everyone. Hoping you had a lovely weekend, a relatively lovely weekend. Today, we're going to keep talking about a new topic. Two quick reminders before I begin talking about today. First, tonight, as I said last week, by midnight tonight, I want to be able to have a list of your topics for the final project. And if you're working on some team with other students, so please let me know who you're working with. So please send me an email by the end of the day today, by tonight, letting me know what is the topic that you chose to work on. It doesn't have to be a very developed and specific topic, but just overall to get a general sense of what you want to do in this project. And if you want to talk about it and to understand more what you need to do and what you want to do, you're more than welcome to come talk to me. Of course, as always, office hours and all the regular channels. Also, later this week, Wednesday or probably Thursday, I will upload an additional short video to the website, and you'll send you the link, of course, with some pointers and tips and some things to understand before you start working on this final project. All right, so let's see. Today is the 29th, so that's what are we going to do today. What did we cover? Last meeting was on Wednesday. So last meeting, we kept talking about audience costs, focusing more on the public angle of it. And how do we know whether citizens actually care about the leaders issuing empty threat and whether they will make them pay for it? And we did that by looking at the different experiments, the work by Tom's, your own survey, which showed that you as citizens care when the leaders of your country or when your leaders are issuing a threat and then following through. We saw that very clearly in the survey result that you had. Then we talked about some other studies that unpacked audience cost a little bit more, showing that elite consensus also matter. And when leaders are able to justify their decision to back down or to back in, which was our other option, also it matters. So if you disagree with the decision to back down, but the leader is able to justify that by providing some additional information, that means that you will view that leader as more competent because the leader behaved based on very recent information. So it's going to be less of a criticism on the idea of backing down. We talked about the other angle of inconsistency, which is backing in, making a promise to stay out and then deciding to go in. And we talked about your survey and the experiment by Levy and his associates about that. And then the last thing we talked about was focusing on another element of this inconsistency, but even one step before that inconsistency, the question of, do we even have to intervene in this specific situation? And that was associated with the term of the belligerence cost, the work by Kurtzer and Rutger, that showed that for some members of the public, of the audience, it matters that you actually make the initial threat to intervene in the conflict. Even before inconsistency comes into play, and it matters for some more and less, the idea of actually issuing the threat matters. And another element that they offered, reminding you, talking about the audience, is the fact that they disaggregated this audience, the different elements within groups of citizens matter for their level of audience cost, whether they are more supportive of international trust, whether they're even their political orientation, their partisanship, all those things also matter. If you have any questions about that, as always, you are more than welcome to email them to me. All right, sorry about that. This week's topic goes back a little bit to issues we talked about earlier in this dimension, and that's power. But we'll also talk about power in the context of deterrence and reputation. We will discuss how the concept of power translates to strategies of deterrence based on both rational as well as psychological explanations, and what are the elements that are comprising those kinds of strategies. So early in the semester, we talked at length about power as a concept, and now, sorry. Okay, so we talked about power and how it was a central aspect within realist theories that view power as a main driver of international interactions, right? From a strategy standpoint, the idea is that the most common use of having an advantage in power and military capabilities, that's what power represents in many cases, is by employing strategies of deterrence or coercion. And today we'll talk about deterrence. So what is deterrence? Deterrence is the use of threats by one party to convince another party to refrain from initiating some course of action. A threat serves as a deterrent to the extent that it convinces the target not to carry out its own intended action because of the cost that it would incur. So I'm trying to deter you from engaging in some kind of action because the content of my threat is to say that if you're going to persist with this action, you're going to pay some cost because of it. Now, how is deterrent comes into play? Now we will see how. In most cases, deterrence refers to threats of a military retaliation against an adversary, that is, applying power, military power, in an attempt to prevent the rival from using its own power to promote any types of foreign policy goals, right? So research overall talks about 4 different situations in which we apply deterrence, or 4 different types. The first is direct immediate deterrence. This is intended to prevent an armed attack against my own territory, and especially in the face of a short-term immediate conflict. So there is a crisis on the border now, and I need to prevent that crisis, so I'm engaged in direct immediate deterrence. A direct general deterrence is intended to prevent an armed attack against my territory, not just in the short term, but also try to prevent the prospect of a military conflict in the long run, right? As an example, after Israel took control of the Golan Heights in the northern part of Israel, after the 1967 war, it engaged in various policy actions which represent a direct general deterrence, which were intended to prevent the Syrians from harassing Israeli forces in that area and keep attacking them. And also to prevent additional conflict in the future, which essentially actually did not work because in 1973 there was another war, but that's a different point. An extended immediate deterrence intended to prevent an armed attack against the territory of another state, so an ally or another country which I'm in close relations with. And the immediate aspect is, again, is preventing an attack in the short term. This is a very prevalent type of deterrence which is employed by major powers. As an example, think about the actions taken by the United States to support South Korea in order to prevent an attack from North Korea. Extended general deterrence is similar to direct general deterrence, preventing an armed attack against, this time it's the territory of another state, with the intention of preventing both short-term crises as well as potential future military clashes. Now, one of the most important elements when we think about success is about, I'm sorry, I said the end. When we think about deterrence, is how do we measure that deterrence was successful or not? And this is measured both from a military standpoint as well as a political standpoint. So from a military standpoint, general deterrence is successful if it prevents adversary leaders from issuing military threats or engaging in actions that escalate any time of peacetime, any type of peacetime competition. Escalate when peacetime competition between countries does not escalate into a crisis or any type of a militarized confrontation, that's successful general deterrence. If I'm able as a leader of a country to prevent my rival from even issuing a threat against me, that's successful deterrence. For the immediate aspect, if I'm able to prevent a crisis that already began to escalate into an all-out conflict or an all-out war between me and my adversary, that's a success from a military standpoint, right? The more complicated aspect of measuring success is from a political standpoint. And we do that by looking at what does it mean to have a failed deterrence, again, from a political standpoint. So there's a couple of conditions there. For example, when a security crisis emerges in the first place, that's a failed deterrence, again, from a political standpoint. If a leader of another country, of my rival, we have some form of competition on resources, on influence, and the leader of that country, of my rival, is issuing a threat, I failed to deter him from the political angle. In the next step, if a crisis that already began escalates to a war, then again, that's a failure of deterrence from a political standpoint, I'm sorry. And lastly, if we're engaged in some form of bargaining during a dispute, during some kind of a more extended type of competition with a rival, and I choose to provide the maximum amount of concessions to my rival in order to avoid from war, I failed from a political standpoint in terms of deterrence, right? Now, the theory of deterrence relies on the logic of rational choice. That is, for leaders that consider the use of force, they will compare the expected utility or the benefits of using force with the utility of refraining from using force and sticking to the status quo. And the rational aspect of deterrence relate to how a military threat can reduce that expected utility of using force by persuading the attacker that an attack will be both costly and unsuccessful. Right? So I need to issue a threat which will be deterrent in the sense that it's going to make my rival understand that the utility of engaging in this military attack for him or her is less useful and is going to be costly and unsuccessful, right? So that means that the most effective deterrent policies are those that decrease the expected utility of using force and at the same time do not reduce the expected utility of the status quo. So the status quo remain more useful for me as well as my rival than the idea of using force. An optimal deterrence policy would even increase the expected utility of not using force. It's going to make my rival understand that by not using force, she's better off, right? That's an optimal deterrence strategy. Finally, one of the side elements of this type of dynamic of issuing deterrent threats is that we are actually also creating incentives for a preemptive attack, because a backlash is possible when I'm issuing a deterrent threat, because it leads my rival to engage in a preemptive attack if my rival will be concerned that my deterrent threat are just a prelude to me engaging in an offensive attack, right? So my rival will be concerned that my deterrent threats are intended to set the stage for me engaging in an attack against her, so she will actually engage in a preemptive attack. Think about it also in the context of the security dilemma, which we talked about early on in the semester. All right, the success of a deterrent threat is highly contingent on that threat being credible. We talked about the concept of credibility a lot over the last couple of weeks. First of all, the deterrent actor must have the military capabilities to actually inflict substantial cost. And also, I also need to have the ability to convince my rival that I will follow through on my threat. I will be resolved that if I'm issuing a threat, stop with what you're doing or you will pay a price for that. My rival needs to be convinced that I will actually follow through on that and not back down. So that leads to the point of signaling in the context of deterrence threat. So the main problem that we have is when we're thinking about every country tries to defend itself. So everybody has incentives to portray themselves as resolved. Everybody that faces every country that faces some form of threat will say, we'll do whatever we need, everything in our power to prevent this threat from materializing upon us, right? So all defenders have the same incentives. So the difficulty for us is to distinguish between a real deterrent threat, you keep what you're doing and I will make you pay for that. How do we, this kind of threat, how do we distinguish between this kind of threat being real or this kind of threat being just a bluff, right? That means that the solution to that will be when the deterrent state, which wants to present that it is resolved, that is, that it will not back down from the threat, have to display a costly signal. A costly signal is another concept that I talked about in previous lectures. These are different types of actions and statements that clearly increase the risk of a military conflict, right? Because I'm engaged in some kind of action. I know if my rival will not accept my threat, we are actually going to war. It also increases the cost of backing down. Everything that I talked about with you last week regarding audience cost. I'm issuing a threat. I need to issue a threat that my rival will believe I will not back down from, or I will pay a price if I'm backing down from. So it has to be a costly signal, which means once we are able to display this type of signal, sending a costly signal in the form of a deterrent threat, we are revealing information about my real intentions and my commitment to defend against an attack. I'm not just bluffing and saying, I will do whatever I can. I will send my Air Force to strike down all your military if you're not back down. I'm actually engaging in a costly signal in this case. I'm actually engaging in an action that I'm aware will have severe cost and consequences if it comes into reality. And that should be something that I do that will convince my rival, right? Now, overall, it may sound simple, right? However, in reality, issuing a credible threat through the use of a costly signal involves a lot of risk. Again, think about it in the context of the security dilemma. Any type of action I'm taking also potentially has an effect on the security of my rival, and how would that lead to the how would that create incentives for different types of behavior from my own rival, right? There's other elements that I have to take under consideration before I'm engaged in issuing a deterrent threat using costly signal. That is the degree of uncertainty regarding the amount of political support, domestic political support, that my action will have, right? How much political support does my costly signal involve? An example for a costly signal, so it's going to give you some sense what it means, will be mobilizing military units. If I'm mobilizing military units towards the border, in which I have some disputes with my rival, that's a costly action. How much support that this action has? That's something that has to be considered before making those kinds of threats. Sometimes we can think about also concerns about my ability to control allies if the signals that I engage on provide unqualified support for them. So if the United States sends 3 aircraft carrier battle groups to the area of to the Korean Peninsula, that represents a strong costly signal to North Korea. But the potential risk that the United States may take is that maybe it's going to allow South Korea to feel, well, we have the backing of the United States, we shouldn't worry, we can engage in our own types of more risky actions. Something that the American administration have to think about before engaging in these types of threats, in these kinds of deterrent threats. And the third is a strategic angle that if I'm engaged in a deterrent threat which involves clear costly signal, I may put my rival in the point that my adversary cannot back down. If I'm sending all my military forces toward the border, my rival may have to respond to that, and my rival may not be able to back down from that, and we're actually going into this process of escalation. All those elements has to be taken under consideration when we decide to engage in sending a costly signal in order to demonstrate that we are indeed here submitting or signaling seriously our deterrent intentions. Now, as you saw, there's a lot of elements that work here on both sides. So we need to send the costly signal to make the deterrent threat credible, but there are a lot of risks associated with that. One way to solve those concerns is to send signals that balance between credibility and stability. Those are different types of policies that mostly rely on the idea of reciprocity as well as conditional cooperation. So there's going to be the ability to achieve those goals on both sides and minimize the risks, right? So those are the basics of deterrence theory. And now I want to focus on 2 topics which are central to deterrence overall. One of them, the first one we'll talk about, is reputation, and how much does reputation matter in the international security context. So first of all, reputation serves a fundamental aspect of deterrence, and we'll talk about now, and now we'll start talking about how exactly. Reputation is the perception of rivals regarding my willingness to risk war. How much I am willing to go into war in order to accomplish my objectives. Now, because, and that's what a lot of the earlier research mostly talked about, and we'll talk about how it changes over the last 10 years or even less, but because one argument can be that everybody can talk. As I said, every defending state can say that it will do everything in its power in order to defend itself. So talk may be cheap. Everybody can talk and say things, right? That means that reputation primarily depends on what the state has done in the past. It's not what I say, it's what I did in the past, all right? A related question in this context is, does reputation really matter? Think about everything that I talked about last week about audience cost. The initial studies that addressed audience cost said that they're very, very important, but we didn't know whether the public actually cares about the leader backing down. And if we didn't have evidence that the public cares about that, then audience cost does not matter, because if the public doesn't care, then audience costs are irrelevant. So similarly, we have to think about reputation. If the country's reputation does not matter, then how does that have an effect on the behavior in the international section? Now, one of the main problems when it comes to reputation is the lack of strong empirical evidence showing that this specific factor, the reputation of a state, serve as a critical factor that shape the behavior. There's a lot of different types of historical cases during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in most of those cases, it shows that the expectations of behavior by each side were almost never based on past behavior. So reputation was not the most powerful aspect in this case. Instead, these were mostly situational conditions such as the military balance, the issues at stake, that serve as a much better predictor of current behavior. So again, those studies have shown us that situational factors matter a lot more than past behavior. So reputation was not a central factor in this case. On the other hand, there are a lot of cases that provided us evidence that adopting a conciliatory type of policy increases the probability of facing more risks, right? So in this case, reputation, the way that you behaved in the past, does have an effect, especially when you talk about what can be viewed as bad reputation. As an example, let's think about the war in the Falklands. The war in the Falklands began with the Argentinian invasion in April of 1982. And some studies of that conflict suggest that the Argentinians' the decision to invade in the spring of 1982, it's not spring actually because it's the southern hemisphere, so it's the beginning of the it was the beginning of the winter, it's called. Anyway, that decision was primarily dependent on the prior confrontations and in which the British seems to display very low level of resolve. So the British, in the eyes of the Argentinians at the time, had a very negative reputation regarding the way that they will behave in response to those kinds of challenges. As an example, the Argentinians relied heavily on the way that the British behaved in the Suez crisis, which we talked about a few weeks back. So the Argentinians had a very strict view regarding bad reputation for the British, which serve as part of their calculus to decide to go to this war. Now, in addition to those reputation effects, there was also situational factors, favorable conditions that the Argentinians enjoyed. Mostly the fact that the islands, the Falkland Islands, were weakly defended from a military standpoint, and they were thousands of miles away from the British mainland. What happened in reality that the Argentinian perception of the British in that case was very, very wrong, because right after the Argentinians were able to invade and take control of the island, the British government, led by former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, sent a very significant task force from the mainland. They were able, after a long and a very, very costly war, to recapture the island. So they paid very high, the British paid a very hard price in blood and military hardware. But at the same time, at the end of the war, they had substantial gains in what? In reputation and in deterrence. Because their behavior in the war set the stage for a very strong reputation for them after the war, right? So overall, the research has provided us with three general approaches to view how reputation affects deterrence. One is called the strong interdependence of commitment. According to that approach, past behavior in international conflict creates strong belief about how the actor will behave in the future. So that means that deterrence credibility is linked over time. The way that you behaved in the past matter for what you're going to do now. The main problem for this approach is that it does not provide us a specific explanation to, first of all, how and why it's going to work. How does the past behavior is going to matter for now? And it pretty much ignores most of the contextual elements. So to solve that, we have a second approach, which is the case-specific credibility, which says the reputation have limited effect on deterrence because credibility in those cases was heavily linked to very specific contextual factors, such as the military balance at the time or the interest. So in the previous case, the credibility of the threats was very, very strong because of different contextual factors at the time. But it does not mean it's going to matter now, right? And the third point, as always, the middle option provides us with the way things are in most cases. That's what's called the qualified interdependence of commitment. According to that approach, reputations from past behavior are drawn under certain conditions. So they will matter mostly when the behavior does not fit with the expectations of the attacker, right? So for example, if a defender does not use force when the attacker would expect that defender to use force, then that's going to mean that the attacker will look at the reputation all differently and will infer that the defender lacks resolve because of some general traits and not specific areas. Now, overall, if we want to use this third approach from an analytic standpoint, the first thing we have to do is to realize what are the expectations and the beliefs of the attacker regarding the defender's responses, which means for us, individuals matter a lot. We have to understand the individual leaders and what are their expectations and their beliefs regarding the behaviors of different states. Okay, so let's take one research which addressed that very important question that I've talked about in the last few minutes. Does reputation matter? That's the work by Weisiger and Yarhi-Milo. They begin from, because of the fact that there's relatively mixed evidence regarding the effect of reputation, whether it is positive, whether it is negative, whether it has an effect at all. One of the points that they argue is that if your reputation does not matter, then it has negative implications, regardless if you engage in the past in positive behavior or negative behavior. Because I talked about the other cases where we had some evidence that negative behavior, bad reputation matters for the future, right? If you set up a precedent as bad reputation, the way that you behave in the past, you're more likely to be attacked in the future. But if reputation does not matter, then even if your resolve in the past, you had positive reputation from past behavior, it should not necessarily mean you will not be attacked in the future, because reputation does not matter. That's the argument. All right. They suggest that one way to think about whether reputation matters, yes or no, is to think about it from a strategic context and through the prism of a rational choice theory. That is, within this theory, reminding you again when I talked about it a few weeks back, one of the important elements we have to think about is updating. Updating means that we are behaving in some manner, we're trying to accomplish some goals, and we get feedback from the environment regarding our behavior. If we get feedback that our behavior is not efficient, we have to change our behavior, right? So that means that the way that we behave in the past behavior, if we put past behavior in this context of updating, should matter for our predictions. So how do we behave in the future, right? And that means that this logic makes having bad reputation very problematic to countries. Because if I behave and I establish to myself a bad reputation, I do not engage in a resolved response when I'm being attacked by another country. So in a subsequent conflict that I will face, the attacker will probably demand more, because in the past I behave in a way that created this bad reputation, right? I already acquiesced in the past. So why would he not try again to attack me? Also, it increases the chances of using military action, because the attacker, following this rational choice process, learned that I am the target more likely to concede, right? So if we think about it in the context of a rational choice process, then reputations, whether they are positive or negative, should have an effect, all right? Mostly negative, by the way. So to test those ideas, they use data on militarized disputes between 1816 and 2001. They're focusing on direct dyad, so two countries, one against another. And their main measure for reputation is the outcome of past conflicts. And they use that in order to assess how it's going to affect being attacked in a militarized dispute. So they run their own bunch of analysis, and this is some of their findings. We will focus first on this table, on this figure here on the left, which shows us how the level of reputation, negative reputation, which is what we have here on the x-axis, how would that affect the probability of being attacked in a subsequent dispute? And we see here that the larger the negative reputation, the probability of being attacked is positive. So there is a relationship between that. Having bad reputation increases the probability that you're going to be attacked in the future. At the same time, we also have the effects of situational factors, such as, for example, relative capabilities, this military capabilities. The closer are the military capabilities between two actors, the probability of additional attack is lower, which makes sense, right? The more attacks we had in the past, it increased the odds I'm going to have also attacks in the future. So overall, what we see from that research is that situational factors matter a lot for how states will behave in international crises and conflicts. But reputation, primarily bad reputation, also has its own set of effects, right? Okay, so we talked a lot about the importance of reputation in the context of deterrence, but one question that comes out of it is, whose reputation? Are we talking about the reputation of the state? The United States has some reputation regarding international conflicts, or is it a reputation for the leader? President Biden has been in office for about 8 weeks now, 9 weeks. what type of reputation does he have, and does it separate from the reputation the United States have when it comes to foreign policy, to international economy, to international negotiations, wherever that may be. So the main question that a lot of the recent research has been focusing on is how do the reputation of new leaders evolve, and how do they begin in the first place, and how do they evolve over time during their tenure, right? So this is the work by Lupton, which was, as far as I remember, on your reading list for today. And she focuses on individual leaders and the development of reputation, and trying to understand at what stage in their tenure it is more critical to start developing those, and how does it change, if at all, during their time in office. So she begins from arguing that when a new leader enters office, then his or her adversaries, suffer from this information gap because they don't know anything about their intentions. President Biden has entered the Oval Office about 2 months ago. The rivals of the United States, whether it is Russia, China, North Korea, whoever you want to call that, have this gap. It's not that they don't know anything about what are the intentions of the new administration regarding different policies, but there is some gap. They're not clear. They have a lot of uncertainty regarding the intentions of the new president, how to address those situations. So to build those reputations, leaders engage in different statements and take different actions when they once they are in their position. And it's important to establish that type of reputation with the actions that they take following those statements. Before taking actual serious actions, it's whether you're actually even following through on your initial statements. All right? So those kind of reputations are mostly built on statements and initial actions taken early in their tenure, and whether the leaders actually follow through on those statements. And the critical signals are being taken pretty much early on. The first chance that leaders have to signal their intentions regarding different issues and build their reputations. So those are the statements that are being issued before taking any actions. Those are crucial in the formation of those reputations, right? So overall, how do leaders begin to develop those reputations? They offer us their positions on different policy issues and different areas, and that serve as the first type of information given to adversaries or other actors in order to close that information gap. Whenever there's already an instance when leaders are able to talk about their intentions regarding and their opinions regarding different situations or different policy actions, they're able to start building their reputations. So the additional question that's related to that is how those early interactions matter for the future. How do those reputations that are built early on in the leader's tenure, how do they matter for future interactions? So one point that she offers is that those earlier statements interact with the actions leader take. So you made some statements regarding how you're going to address the crisis in East Asia, and the actions that you took in accordance with those statements, those create expectations about future behavior. Did you follow through? That gave you some form of reputation. You did not. You followed through on some level. All right? That creates expectations. Also, initial perceptions regarding the level of resolve condition any kind of subsequent assessment, which for reputation represents a problem. How can I change my reputations once there's a very substantial difference from any kind of earlier perceptions? As an example, we can think about the behavior and the interactions between former President Kennedy and the Russian Premier Khrushchev. Sorry. So the Soviet leader expected President Kennedy to act in a very resolved manner when the Berlin crisis escalated in the middle of 1961. So the Berlin crisis included tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union in Berlin. It began already before Kennedy went into office. It began somewhere in 1958, but it escalated in June of 1961. And once again, Khrushchev expected, based on Kennedy's prior statements, that he's going to behave in a very resolved manner, because Kennedy made very strong statements regarding those events and the American responsibility towards Eastern Europe. However, the actual weak response that the United States has implemented during the Berlin crisis, which ended a few weeks later with the formation of the Berlin Wall, made Khrushchev less dependent on his earlier impression. So those early statements by Kennedy did not matter anymore. And he actually based his view of the new American president on the recent action. And the things that took place in Cuba and the Bay of Pigs a couple of not too long afterwards did not help in improving JFK's reputation. So once Khrushchev has his initial perception about what he thinks about Kennedy after the Berlin crisis, it was very hard to Kennedy to change that perception. He had the reputation established in the eyes of his rival. This is an example about how those things change over time, how they're established early on, and the difficulties in changing them over time. So going back to the work by Lupton, she tests her theory about the establishment of reputation and the potential changes in reputation using a survey experiment, focusing primarily on using the process tracing method, which allows us to track changes in how, in our context, reputation is formed early on and how it may change over time. And that's the main benefit of a process tracing, because we're focusing on the process itself, on different phases within the process, and you're going to see that in part of the results. And she assessed multiple factors that might affect those reputation. That is, first of all, the statements by the leader themselves, which is what she argued early on are an important element in forming those reputations. Then the actions of those leaders, and any kind of little personal traits. So in terms of what she finds overall that early statements have a strong effect on the formation of reputation. That in any kind of initial interaction between two individuals, she uses the public for that, but the idea is that any kind of an initial interaction between two leaders, offering very strong statements, have a strong effect on appearing resolved. That means that creates some kind of basis for reputation. At the same time, she also shows that past actions also matter a lot for the creation of reputation of resolve. So in terms of the different factors, what we see here is the different effects of the different factors here. We have here past behavior, we have here statements, and what you see on your screen is a type of a coefficient plot which shows the effect. So we have to focus on all those small markers here which do not cross the zero line, because if they cross the zero line, that means that their effect is zero. If they are on the plus side, that means they have a positive effect. So the past actions by leaders matter a lot in different stages, right? In the summit stage, in the negotiation stage, but at the same time, leader statements, which was her main point, that's the basics for creating this reputations, also has a very strong effect, even more so in what she did in her experiment, the summit stage. And she also accounts, as we said, for the effects of interactions between statements and behavior. So what we see here are, again, different factors. We have, again, the zero value here, and everything that's on the plus side represents a positive effect. Everything on the minus side represents a negative effect. So leaders or individuals that engage in irresolute statements and also display irresolute behavior, that's a negative effect on their reputation. And exactly the opposite for a positive one, resolute statements and resolute behavior. But in the middle, we have those contrasts. So issuing irresolute statements, but engaging in resolute behavior has a very positive effect on reputation, which suggests that behavior matters a lot, right? Even though, as we saw, statements also matter. Resolute statements followed by irresolute behavior has a negative effect, not as strong as the positive one, but it doesn't have an effect. This is an example for where Kennedy was when it comes to the way Khrushchev saw him after the Berlin crisis. Strong statements followed by irresolute behavior, right? One of the important contributions of her study is with regard to the role that rhetoric plays in foreign policy, because a lot of the earlier research suggested that statements do not necessarily matter. As I said, when I began talking about it, I said, everybody can talk. Talk may be cheap, but she actually shows that statements are critical in signaling resolve. In addition, she also shows that leaders develop reputation beyond the state. So there is a reputation of the United States, and there is a reputation for President Reagan, for that matter. And those reputations are highly likely to be established early on in their tenure, when they have to deliver this information to the rivals and develop those reputations. And it's very much likely that those reputations will persist throughout the durations of time that they're in office. Okay? All right. Reputation in our context will relate in many cases to resolve. What is resolve? That is the expected behavior in conflict, right? So we have reputation based on the way that we behave in many cases, the way that the statements we make and then we behave. And resolve is the concept that connect between them. And I want to talk a little bit about that more. So resolve is the extent to which a state is willing to risk war to achieve its objectives, how much I'm willing to risk war by following through on my previous statements. And the resolve of an individual depends on how he values the stakes involved and the cost of fighting. That's the classical view of resolve is based that this is based on the stakes involved and the cost of fighting. However, resolve is also very individual. I view the issues at stakes and the cost in a way that's maybe very different than others. So that means it's based on my perception. And that means for our discussion, we can also think about resolve as an individual disposition, as an individual element, not just as a situational. It's not just the issues matter for how resolved the leader of the United States may be. The issues may be relatively similar, but it's possible that President Obama and President Trump will view the events very differently and will view it from a resolve standpoint very, very differently. So it suggests that individually it matters. So his work, the 2017 paper that I want to talk about now, expands the idea of looking at resolve beyond the situational element. So it's also an individual element. And he does that by invoking those behavioral aspects. First of all, in terms of definition, resolves you as a firmness, as steadfastness of purpose, that is maintaining the ability to maintain behavior despite contrary inclinations or temptations to back down. And the definition places a lot of emphasis on a very determined and a sustained effort despite the growing number of temptations to the contrary. That's the idea of resolve from a behavioral standpoint. From a psychological, the relevant psychological traits which are related to that are having strong willpower, the ability to self-regulate and to self-control, right? That makes it a little bit easier to when we think about that. Now, one question that comes out of it, well, resolve, we're talking about leader, we're talking about international conflicts and international negotiations. Why should we care about this dispositional angle? So he offers a set of explanations for that. For example, one is the idea of observations and measures. That is, how do we observe a resolved person? How do we know that an individual that we observe before us behave in a resolved manner or not? The problem is that we may face the risk of what's called tautology. That is, we infer about resolve from the same outcomes we seek to explain. We say, he did not back down in the crisis, so he is resolved. But then we go back and ask, okay, so how do we measure resolve? We measure resolve by not backing down from the crisis. So we use the same aspect to explain the outcome and to explain what led to the outcome. That's tautology. Also, we know that resolve represents behavior. However, from an individual standpoint, we're still not clear where it comes from. What are the different individual level elements that serve as the mechanisms that link different causes to our behavior, which we know is a resolved behavior? We think that this is the resolved type of behavior. Also, it makes more sense because resolute person is a persistent person. So it's a kind of a natural link between them, looking at that from the individual disposition standpoint. And finally, thinking about resolve as an individual dispositions allow us to study this concept in a more interdisciplinary fashion by combining research from IR, economics, and psychology. So what constitutes resolve according to this research? The author proposes to use an interactionist approach. That is, an integration of a situational factors, different elements in the environment with the individual dispositions. And those will shape the level of resolve that an individual will display. So situational factors include, for example, different types of cost, human cost or reputational cost. If the costs are very, very high, I'm likely to be less resolved, right? Because I pay very high prices. So maybe I should not persist in those types of actions. That's how the environment will affect my level of resolve. But he also talks about individual aspects here, for example, time preferences, and that is how patient you are, how much do you value the future. A very patient person is likely to be very, very resolved. A very patient person accepts the fact that he may pay some cost now, but he'll be able to accomplish his objectives in the future. That's the idea of time preferences. Risk preferences is a little bit more complicated because we have to balance between the risk of fighting, right? Or the risk of withdrawing from the fight because there's potential cost there as well, right? So the effect here is not necessarily a linear effect, might be not linear. To assess those different types of factors, he engages in an experiment. The experiment asks participants to go through multiple iterations of a conflict situations, and they have to decide when to stop the intervention. They go through a military intervention, and they go through the same for different multiple iterations of that military intervention. And when they stop, that means that the number of times that they went through this intervention process is a measure for their level of resolve. So some of the findings that he had, we have here again those different coefficients showing their effects on the probability or the change in percentages of withdrawal, which means if you're likely to withdraw from the conflict, that means you're less resolved. So we see here, for example, the situational factor of cost. The higher the cost, that means that it has a negative effect on your level of resolve. And we also see here some of the individual elements, such as time preferences. The more patient you are, how that's going to have an effect on your level of resolve, right? A few more of this. This is a more specific type of results where we can think about in terms of individual elements and resolve. So what we see here, for example, this is the present bias. This is the time preferences factor, and that shows higher values here represent more of a long-term orientation. And what we see here, individuals who are more patient, their withdrawal, the probability that they will withdraw is actually lower. So there will be more resolve in this case. All right. All right, so to complete our discussion, now that we know that resolve can be a function of both the environment as well as the individual, I want to talk about a final aspect, and that's more of the strategic nature. How do we look at others and know that they are resolved? How do we assess the degree of resolve within other individuals? When I'm looking at President Biden, who faces now kind of a dispute with with Iran when it comes to the nuclear agreement, do I think that the president is resolved, yes or not? And what am I looking at in order to establish that opinion? And the basic question here that we're thinking about is, what are the cues that individuals are using to assess the degree of resolve in others? What am I looking for in the behavior or the actions or the statements of others in order to form that opinion? And it is an information-based question. And we can think about those types of issues that I'm looking at as the different sets of heuristics, which are, again, cognitive elements, shortcuts that helps us form an opinion. We're looking at that different types of elements in order to understand how, in our context, resolve is that individual. So they offer two broad categories. This is also a work by Kurtzer and a few other associates, which actually came out a few weeks ago. So they look at different categories related to the state level and the leader level, as well as behaviors. So characteristics, for that matter, include, for example, the extent of capabilities. So if we have high level of capabilities, if I see high level capabilities for that country, I expect the leader to be very resolved. Regime type, if the leader is a leader of a democracy, I expect that leader to be resolved. Why? Because of all the dynamics of audience cost that I've talked about. Also remember the selection argument, right? When democracy is going to conflict, that conflict they chose to engage in, they're likely to invest very much in that conflict, so they will be resolved. Also think about leader level factors here. We can think about military experience. And there's also the idea of times in office. New leaders are more resolved or less resolved. And even gender is one of the factors they propose there. Male leaders will be more resolved than female leaders. They also account for different types of behavior. We can think about reputation. The way that you behaved in the past will affect how resolved I think you are for the future. So if you back down in the past, I'm going to view you as less resolved. But we can also think about costly signal, what types of signals you're engaged in. So before I talk about their results of their analysis, I'll stop for today's attendance word. That is the word sound. Sound is the attendance word for today. So how did they estimated the effects of those different characteristics? They engaged in what's called a conjoint experiment. Now, remember when I talked about experiments a couple of lectures ago, I emphasized that the main benefit from a method standpoint that an experiment offers us is the ability to isolate one causal factor and see what effect it has on the outcome, right? So for example, when you did the audience cost experiment, the main factor that we changed was the factor of inconsistency. Some of you read a leader who was consistent, some of you read a leader who is inconsistent, and we compared your results to see whether this inconsistency aspect made a difference. That's focusing on one causal factor. Now, what conjoint experiment allows us is to assess multiple factors at the same time and estimate the effects of each component independently on the outcome. So not just inconsistency. So inconsistency and the gender of the leader and the age of the leader and whether the leader is a leader of a democracy or not. Multiple factors at the same time and still assess their effects independently. So to do that, usually this type of research design relies on text that respondents have to read. So this is an example for one vignette that they used. And it's a little small, so you don't have to look at the details, but you have here are two countries which are in some kind of dispute. And on the left side here, we have different types of factors. All the factors I talked about in the previous slide, for example, the type of regime. So this is a democracy, and then there's also a democracy. We have here interest. We have the leader background. We have here previous behavior. That's the reputation. We have current behavior. We have military capability. So the different factors are here. And in this table, we can actually vary the different values, right? So, for example, military capabilities for this country, this does not have a powerful military, and this one does have. So we can vary the values of those factors and then estimate their effect on our outcome, which in this case is this question. If you had to choose between the two countries, which is more likely to stand firm? In other words, which is more likely to be more resolved, right? That's how we measure that using the conjoint experiment design. What do they find? Now, if you want to look at that after you finish watching the video, you can press that link. It's gonna send you to the paper itself, because this is, as it says here, it's a very big figure. So I will jump to that figure now. Not this one. There it is. So this is their figure of results. What we see here are some of the results. So for example, and you have to ignore this long line and just look at those. You see this is the 0. So once again, this is the level of effects, and we always compare them to the first one. So for example, if we want to look at capabilities, we compare high capabilities compared to low capabilities. So this is low capabilities, and the effect, we don't look at the effect. It's supposed to be 0. High capabilities compared to low capabilities has a positive effect. So if I'm looking at a country which has high capabilities, I believe it has a positive effect on the level of resolve of the leader of that country. Similarly for the stakes. We can see here, regime type. Democracies the leader of democracies appear as less resolved than leader of dictatorships, which is kind of surprising when you think about the theory, right? We have here leaders, there's not much difference we see here. We see here a difference between having a military service or not. If you have military service, those leaders appear to be more resolved than leaders with no military service. We can go down here for standing firm, backing down. So this is the reputation, right? So if you are standing firm compared to, if the same leader stands firm compared to a different leader, it has a positive effect. But when you're backing down, bad reputation has a negative effect on how resolved you appear. And the actions that you take, if you issue a public threat, you appear resolved. If you mobilize troops, you appear resolved. All right. So those are the different factors that they assess, and that's what the conjoint experiment allows them to do. Right. Let's go back to our slides. We are really at the end today. So you see, as I said, as I showed you on the slide, some of these different elements, the state characteristics that matter less or more for our view of resolve, as well as individual ones. Okay. With that, if you want to read more, I highly recommend those papers. A lot of them are focusing on the individual aspects of reputation of resolve. So I highly recommend that if you want to read more. I remind you one more time, by midnight tonight, make sure you send me an email with the topic of your final project. And if you're working with other students, also let me know so I'll know who's working with who. With that, I am done for today, and I will see you later this week. Bye, everyone.